I'm Noah Bastido, and my presentation is on the causes and impacts of the Great Recession, which is also known as the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. The story of the financial crisis is one that's rather expansive, so it's important to start with the state of the financial system leading into the crisis. And as you'll see from looking at that state of the financial system, is that there were a variety of causes that created kind of a perfect storm effect to lead into the Great Recession. And that there is blame to be spread throughout the entire financial system. Not really one entity or group can solely be blamed for what happened. A lot of different groups share the responsibility for what went down. And it's very important to understand the pre-crisis environment of like the 1990s and the early 2000s before the crisis to really get a good picture of what went down. The first really major piece of the pre-crisis environment were the low interest rates of the time. You see, the Fed funds rate had fallen from 6.5% in late 2000 to just 1% in June of 2003. And this is significant as the Fed funds rate is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another, meaning that when the Fed funds rate is pushed down, all the other interest rates in the economy naturally go down with it, including an interest rate that would be significant to the financial crisis, mortgage interest rates. Low interest rates also means low returns on bonds, so people who are looking for long-term investments to yield them a lot of money were forced to turn away from bonds and look for other places to put their money to gain a return. Though mortgage rates at the time drove up the demand for housing, as many more people could now afford to pay mortgages than ever before. Now, the next piece that needs to be understood is the changes in legislation that had happened prior to the financial crisis. And the really major piece of legislation that had been passed in that time period was the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999. And the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act essentially overturned the provisions that were set forth in the Glass-Steagall Act way back in 1933. Now, the Glass-Steagall Act was put into place as a response to the Great Depression, and what it said was that investment banks and commercial banks couldn't be merged together into one bank, as to protect banks from making investments with their depositors' money. Now, at this point in time in 1999, there had been other measures in place to prevent this from happening, so the government thought it was a good idea to overturn Glass-Steagall with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act to help their banks be more competitive. And this allowed banks, stock brokerage companies, and insurance companies to now merge together. And this helped American banks compete with foreign banks better. But unfortunately, it also gave commercial banks the freedom to create the very tools that led to their downfall. The financial tools that the banks were now creating in mass due to the new legislation were CDOs and mortgage-backed securities. CDOs are financial products such as credit card debt, mortgage debt, and other types of debts that are packaged together and sold on a secondary market to any investors who wish to get in on them. And mortgage-backed securities are essentially CDOs that are just filled with mortgages instead of other types of debt as well. And these became popular among banks as it allowed the bank to transfer any risk from these assets to investors for an immediate return in exchange. And mortgage-backed securities were popular among investors because they had a high rate of return at the time due to a growing housing market that the US had been experiencing, which is reflected in the chart included in this slide. It shows that up until about 2006, the total value of the housing market was on the rise overall. So investors wanted a slice of that growing market. This leads into subprime mortgages' role in the financial crisis, as the rate at which mortgage-backed securities were being bought up by investors incentivized banks to give out as many mortgages as they possibly could. And this unfortunately created a moral hazard for the banks, as there was little incentive anymore to ensure that banks were giving out mortgages that were in reality sound investments, since they knew that no matter what mortgages they gave out, that people would buy them up almost immediately in the form of mortgage-backed securities. And this became a big problem when banks ran out of individuals with good credit scores to give mortgages to, because they were now forced to turn to individuals with poor or even no credit rating at all to pump out more mortgages to put into mortgage-backed securities. And mortgages that were given to these type of individuals were known as subprime mortgages. Investors kept on buying mortgage-backed securities filled with these subprime mortgages because the housing market was still growing, and they knew that even if the borrowers defaulted on their mortgages, that they would still be left with a house, which may even have more value than when it was originally purchased, due to the growing market. Another piece that made banks more apathetic overall was that they had believed that they had become too big to fail, and even if they did make poor choices that led to their downfall, that the government would bail them out regardless. Unfortunately, the housing market didn't keep continually growing like all these investors thought it would. In fact, when interest rates began to naturally rise from their low rates that they had been coming into the financial crisis, everything collapsed. The issue was that many of the mortgages that had been given out during this time were actually adjustable rate mortgages, meaning that as interest rates went up, so too would the interest rates on the mortgages. And this meant that mortgage holders all over the country suddenly saw their monthly payments balloon. And as a result, many subprime borrowers began defaulting on their mortgages. The nation began entering a financial crisis as a result. You see, the sudden influx of defaults rapidly increased the available supply of housing, which naturally, when supply goes up for something, the prices on it go down. And the prices of housing suddenly began to rapidly fall down. This meant that banks were left with worthless subprime mortgages on their books and no one willing to buy them anymore, losing them trillions of dollars. And on top of that, anyone who had owned CDOs or mortgage-backed securities suddenly began losing massive amounts of money as well. Now we move into some of the ramifications of the financial crisis, the first of which being that banks began to fail. The damage that had been caused by subprime lending drove many banks during the time period to extinction, and the first major bank to follow suit was the bank Bear Stearns, which had been a giant of the industry just months before the financial crisis. And in late 2007, it sold at $2 a share to the bank JP Morgan Chase. And it would prove to be the first domino of the financial crisis, as between 2008 and 2012, 475 banks in total would fail. A rather astounding number. There are many individual incidents that occurred during the financial crisis which show the massive scope of how big the crisis really spread. For example, the United Kingdom experienced the first run on a bank that had ever occurred in their nation in the past 140 years, and it was on a bank called Northern Rock. This incident really hallmarked just how globalized the world economies had become, that when one such as the US would encounter a struggle, other nations' economies around the world struggled as well. The crisis also caused businesses outside of the banking industry to struggle in other instances. AIG, an insurance company, completely collapsed due to their credit default swaps which they had owned. A credit default swap pays out when a borrower defaults on one of their loans, meaning that due to all the defaults that had been happening in the housing industry at once, AIG had to pay out millions in these credit default swaps simultaneously. Another industry that was affected by the financial crisis, other than banking and insurance, was the automotive industry. Automotive companies during this time struggled to remain liquid, as credit for car loans were hard to come by during the time, which caused auto sales to plummet by 40%. The sheer damage to the economy by the financial crisis is best demonstrated by the empirical data of the time. And some of these statistics are that the stock market's total value fell 57.8% in a year and a half. Additionally, housing prices dropped 18.3% in just 3 years. Furthermore, household wealth fell by 14.1% in a single year, meaning that families all over the nation had far less money to spend than they did just a year or two ago. And finally is the unemployment rate, which is generally cited as one of the best indicators of how an economy is performing. It shot up to 10% within the crisis. The next piece of the picture for the financial crisis that needs to be examined is how the United States responded to this crisis. And one of the first actions that was taken by the Federal Reserve, as they elected to lower interest rates immediately as they caught wind of the crisis. The Federal Reserve adopted a policy of quantitative easing, and part of that policy was to lower interest rates through lowering the federal funds rate, which, as I discussed earlier, lowers interest rates throughout the entire economy. Now, the Fed actually lowered the federal funds rate to nearly zero in a hopeful attempt to stimulate the economy. Lawmakers became quickly involved in the response to the financial crisis, as lawmakers pushed forward the Emergency Economic Stability Act, which was enacted in 2008 and is generally known as the bailout of the banks. The Emergency Economic Stability Act introduced the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which acted as a reverse auction in which the government would purchase back struggling assets from the bank as a way to give banks a return, at least on some of these assets, and many of these assets were subprime mortgages. The next big piece of legislation to be enacted by lawmakers in response to the financial crisis didn't come until 2010, and this was the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, the Dodd-Frank Act introduced many different provisions that completely overhauled regulation inside the financial industry. One of the major things it did was it created the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is tasked with identifying early warning signs of risks in the financial system. And one of the major things that this council would do was it would find banks that were integral to the survival of the economy and turn them over to the Fed for closer inspection. One of the other major provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act was that it created the Volcker Rule, which once again forced investment banks to be completely separate from commercial banks, essentially reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been overturned years prior by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Not only was it lawmakers and regulators who responded to the crisis, but banks themselves actually stepped up and made some adjustments themselves. One of the first major adjustments that banks made was to increase the amount of reserves that they kept on hand, and this is shown as during 2008, banks increased their total reserves from $2 billion to $800 billion by the end of the year. This helped banks remain liquid in the case of future unexpected losses, such as what they suffered from subprime mortgages. Sadly, some banks were left with no other change to make except to merge with other banks. And all the consolidation that happened during this time between banks created many of the nation's current top banks that we've come to know. The last thing we have to assess with the financial crisis is what exactly is the lasting impact of the crisis. And the first part of that is the differences in the financial system nowadays as compared to 2008. The first thing that really jumps out as a difference is that the industry is much more heavily regulated nowadays. This is depicted in the fact that the SEC has adopted 67 new rules as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act. On top of this, the Federal Reserve is more closely monitoring banks that are essential to the economy, as I discussed earlier with the Financial Stability Oversight Council. This isn't to say that there isn't also similarities between how the economy is currently constructed and how it was constructed in 2008. One area where these similarities shine through is the size of banking institutions nowadays. Banks are even larger now, due to all the consolidation and bailouts that occurred as a result of the financial crisis. Less banks are being created every day, and as a result, only 6 banks manage half of the assets in the entire banking industry. This means that banks are still considered too big to fail, and that if they ever were to fail again in the future, that the government would likely have to bail them out, just like in 2008. We must also ask the question of how successful was the response to the crisis overall. And according to the statistics, it appears to have been largely successful. One of the major statistics that backs up this idea is that bank failures have been declining ever since the crisis, and even hit 0 in 2018. What's more, bank failures are consistently low to this day, which is particularly amazing when you take into account that the economy is going through another recession, one which has been brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Another statistic which I believe demonstrates the success of the response to the financial crisis is GDP, and GDP rebounded to positive growth in just 2010 after only suffering 2 years of negative growth, meaning that something was clearly done right as the economy rebounded so quickly. Another way in which we can gauge the success of the response to the financial crisis is through the changes that have been subsequently overturned since then. And you'll come to find that not many major changes were really overturned at all. One minor change that was overturned was that interest rates naturally returned to a normal level, as it was unsustainable to keep them so close to 0 forever. There were also some slight alterations that have been made to the Dodd-Frank Act since then. In 2018, a bill was passed that exempts banks with assets between $50 billion and $250 billion from close monitoring by the Federal Reserve. The justification for this is that these banks are regional banks and not necessarily essential to the survival of the economy, so they shouldn't be regulated as if they are. However, other than that, Dodd-Frank and all the other changes have remained relatively the same. Really, the final piece that can be used to gauge the response to the financial crisis is what experts think of that response today. And as a matter of fact, most experts believe that the response to the crisis was largely acceptable and actually kept the economy out of sinking into a depression. And when proving this fact, most experts point to the statistics that have come out since then and the few changes that have been altered since the crisis. However, there are some experts that believe the bailout of the bank specifically sets a dangerous precedent. And they believe this because trillions of taxpayer dollars specifically went to the bailout. And since the bank's beliefs that no matter what happens to them, the government will always step in and save them have essentially been affirmed by the bailout, the banks are now more likely to take risky actions in the future, which could in the long run end up costing taxpayers even more money. So to recap, the financial crisis is a rather expansive topic, which has had a variety of causes and impacts on the world. And many of these impacts can still be felt to this very day. Once again, I'm Noah Bastido, and thank you all for listening.